So this is my book, The Viewing Party, that was shortlisted and then later on win the Singapore Literature Prize in the year 2014. And this book is kind of the thickest book that I've ever written, quite a number of pages, in a way that because in the center part of it there is a short story, and after which all the different sections seems to wrap around that centerpiece of the short story. And I have a section called The Viewing Party Part 1 and then a later section called The Viewing Party Part 2. These are all prose poems or maybe even microfiction of exactly 100 words each. And that formed like the core of the book. And the other sections involve a section about my grandfather who had passed on, and also a section based on a book that was abandoned. I started writing a novel based on the local movie Eating Air, and then that did not materialize, and then I took some of those abandoned works and reworked them into a series of writings that form a particular section here. And then the last part talks a bit more about how I would interpret the viewing party, which touches on the topics of cinema and death, things that are put on display, for example, in life, and how we as a party viewing other people doing different things. So what I'll do is that I will read one poem from this first section called Dragonflies, which is about my late grandfather. And I'll read part 3. So this talks about a memory that I had of grandfather, how I had once tried to convince him, well actually I didn't try to convince him not to quit smoking, sorry. And I thought about it, but I didn't find the right way to actually communicate it to him. So this is part 3 of Dragonflies. Uncle claims that grandfather had turned over a new leaf just prior to his death and given up smoking. So there's no need to toss cigarettes into the coffin, even though there are packs remaining. No, the dead do not need temptation for company. Perhaps just a new pair of glasses to keep the scenery in focus. Still, it's funny how I had learned one day about the evils of smoking in school, then thought of persuading grandfather to quit, except that no words came, and I turned and left his room, lived with the guilt for years, till I forgot, but still remember that his Dunhill boxes are maroon emblazoned with gold. Okay, I'll read another piece from The Viewing Party Part 1. And this is one that is called Grandmother's Tale, which is obviously about my grandmother. And there's also one bit about my grandfather. And it talks a bit about the Second World War. Grandmother's Tale. After the war, she returned with the other women to the jungle. There they had earlier hidden their cash, gold chains, jade pendants, and other heirlooms from the invading Japanese. Everyone else managed to find what they were looking for, but no matter how deep she dug, she could not locate her secret hoard. Soon the puzzlement melted away, to give rise to humiliation, then anger. Casting her suspicion on her gambler husband, she wanted to scream her heart out, but all she could muster was a strange composure, a silence that she could not deny, still spoke of love. I'll move on to my next book. So this is Frottage, first published in 2005. So this book is actually a lot of travel poems, and some poems that are actually more about Singapore than Australia, where a lot of poems were kind of set in. And Frottage is actually a title that some people have problems pronouncing, like whether is it a French word or is it an English word, or do you pronounce it as frottage or frottage? It's a kind of method of drawing where you would place a piece of paper on a rough surface, and when you rub your pencil over it, there's a certain textured pattern that would emerge on the piece of paper. And I thought that that's a good way to talk about how I would gain all this impression when I go to a new country, not just in terms of being inspired by landscape, rough terrains, the wildlife and nature, but also in terms of conversations that I've had with people that I've made friends with, and also finding connections between Australia and Singapore, two island nations, obviously one much bigger than the other. And this is just a very short, simple poem. And I was inspired by a trip that I've made to a place called Townsville. I was staying in a guest house, and I was listening to the sound of nature outside of this guest house. And I was thinking about the sound of the trees that I hear at that time. And then later on, I wrote this particular poem. The habit of leaves. What I miss living in a high-rise, the occasional fidgeting of trees, rattling their leaves to make me think it's rain. Okay, so that's a really short poem. And I think I'll read a slightly longer poem. And coincidentally, I think this touched on my grandmother again. Just a very slight reference. It's about my uncle and his family moving over to Adelaide, where they've kind of migrated to and set up base, and of course the cousins that I have not met for years. So this poem is simply titled Adelaide. Adelaide. When my uncle packed his family and migrated, I hadn't grown old enough to barter political views with him. Perhaps money was also one of the reasons for setting up his private clinic in an Adelaide suburb. I still remember clowning with my cousins in their big house on 6th Avenue when we were much younger. They must have all acquired an accent by now. And they grow fruits, I hear, which we can only buy in supermarkets here. The youngest cousin, born there, speaks no Hakka. I do not know how he manages to communicate with his grandmother during her yearly visits. She probably spreads her love by brewing authentic dishes, and on rightful occasions might hold his hand the way my grandmother once held mine, often with a silence already understood within our dialect's unbroken music.